The termination letter landed on my desk at 2:17 inches the afternoon. I remember the exact time because I had just come back from the break room with a cup of coffee I hadn't wanted. The kind of thing you get just to have somewhere to walk. Something to hold. The envelope was cream-colored. Thick stock. The kind they only use for formal correspondence. My name was typed across the front in clean black font. Marcus Delaney. Personal and confidential. I sat down slowly, set the coffee on the corner of my desk, picked up the envelope. I already knew what it was. Richard Calloway had been my direct supervisor for 11 years. I had watched him build his reputation on other people's work. I had watched him take credit for projects I'd bled through weekends to finish. Had smiled at the right moments and stayed quiet at the wrong ones. I was good at that, staying quiet. My father used to say it was my best quality and my worst flaw. Sometimes, in the same breath, I opened the envelope. Dear Mr. Delaney, it is with regret that we inform you. I stopped reading after the third line. I knew the rest. What I didn't expect was the knock at my office door 40 seconds later. She didn't wait for me to answer. Sandra walked in the way. She always did, like the space already belonged to her. Like my presence in it was the thing that required permission. She was wearing the gray blazer I'd always liked on her. The one with the small gold buttons she said she'd found at a vintage shop in Midtown. Her hair was pulled back. She looked composed. She looked like someone who had rehearsed this. Behind her, framed in the doorway like he was posing for something, was Richard Calloway. He was smiling. Not the polite kind of smile. Not the sympathetic kind. The kind that has been waiting a long time to happen. Sandra set a manila folder on my desk. She didn't sit down. I think you know what this is, she said. I looked at the folder. I looked at Richard. I looked back at Sandra. Divorce papers. I said, my attorney says it's straightforward. She said, given the asset situation. The asset situation. I almost laughed. The asset situation, at that precise moment, was something neither of them understood at all. I'm not going to make this ugly. Marcus, she continued, we both know this hasn't been working. You've been checked out for years. Richard and I, she paused, like she was deciding how much to say. We've been spending time together. It started 6 months ago. I wanted you to hear it from me. Richard said nothing. He kept smiling. I picked up the divorce papers. I read the first page slowly, the way I'd read the termination letter, with the same detached calm that had served me poorly in most social situations, but was, right now, the only thing keeping the room from tilting. I set them back on the desk. Okay, I said. Sandra blinked. Okay, I'll have my attorney review these. She looked at Richard. Richard's smile flickered slightly, like a lamp with a loose bulb. That's it, she said. That's it. I said, what I did not tell her, what I had not told anyone. Not yet. Not even my own attorney, was that 4 days earlier I had received a call from a law firm in Philadelphia. The kind of call that changes the temperature of a room, even when you're the only one in it. My uncle, Graham Ellison Hartwell, had died. Graham was my mother's older brother. He was 73. Had never married. Had no children. And had spent the better part of 4 decades building a private investment holding company called Hartwell Capital Group into something that, depending on the quarter, was worth somewhere between $400 and $500 million. He was precise, private, and particular about almost everything, including, as it turned out, who would inherit his life's work. The answer, according to the attorneys at Felling, Krause, and Mack, was me. Not entirely. There were provisions. A charitable trust received a meaningful portion. 2 longtime employees received generous bequests. A cousin in Arizona received the lake house. but the controlling interest in Hartwell Capital Group 54.7% of voting shares, along with the chairman's seat on the board, went to Marcus Arthur Delaney. Me. What made this more than a matter of personal inheritance was a detail I had been carefully processing for 4 days, cross-referencing in my head against everything I knew about my employer. Vantage Group Holdings. Hartwell Capital Group held a 38% equity stake in Vantage Group Holdings. My boss, Richard Calloway, Senior Vice President of Operations. The man currently standing in the doorway of my office with a smile, I would not forget, worked for a company that was substantially owned by the estate I had just inherited. I had not yet told my attorney. I had not told my sister. I had not posted anything, said anything, or given any indication to any person that the previous 4 days of my life had happened in a different world than the one they thought I still occupied. I signed the divorce papers 3 days later, in a conference room downtown, across a table from Sandra and a man named Gerald Fitz who wore a watch I recognized as more expensive than my car. I was calm. I was cooperative. I agreed to terms that, given what I now knew, were more than fair to Sandra and would cost me very little in the long run. My own attorney, a quiet woman named Patricia Voss, who I'd hired specifically because she listened more than she spoke, had reviewed the asset disclosures and said, gently, that I might want to revisit them before signing. Sign them, I said. Marcus, Patricia, sign them. She looked at me for a moment the way people look at someone who has said something they don't quite understand but suspect might be intentional. Then she signed. 32 days after the afternoon, Sandra and Richard walked into my office. I was no longer an employee of Vantage Group Holdings. My key card had been deactivated. My parking spot had been reassigned. A going-away card had circulated, signed by 12 people, 3 of whom I was fairly certain had never learned my last name. I spent those 32 days doing several things simultaneously. I met, in person and in private, with the 4 remaining members of Hartwell Capital Group's board. They were cautious with me at first, which I expected. I had no background in investment management. I was not Graham Hartwell. What I had, as I explained to each of them, across 4 separate dinners at 4 separate restaurants in 3 different cities, was the voting shares, the legal authority, and a patience for process that I had spent 11 years at Vantage Group developing by necessity. By the end of the 4th dinner, I had their confidence, not their enthusiasm. Confidence would be enough. I also spent those 32 days reviewing, with Patricia Voss and 2 colleagues she brought in, the full scope of Hartwell's position in Vantage Group Holdings. What we found, when we looked carefully, was not scandalous. It was something quieter and, in some ways, more useful, a pattern of underperformance, questionable leadership decisions, and a board that had grown comfortable and slow. The kind of situation that, to the right kind of shareholder, with the right kind of patience, was an opportunity. I didn't rush. I want to be specific about that, because I think there is a version of this story that turns into something it wasn't. I was not building toward revenge. I was not sitting in a dark room drawing up plans to humiliate 2 people who had humiliated me. What I was doing was slower and less dramatic and, I think, more honest. I was simply deciding what I actually wanted. Now that I had the means to have it, what I wanted was to build something. What I wanted was the chairman's seat on a board I had inadvertently inherited the right to occupy. What I wanted was to run something well. For once, instead of watching someone else run it badly and smiling at the right moments. The Vantage Group Board convened its quarterly meeting on a Tuesday in October, in a room on the 34th floor of a building in Midtown that I had visited once before, years ago, as part of a delegation presenting a logistics report that Richard had put his name on. I arrived 12 minutes early. I was wearing a dark navy suit, A white shirt. No tie. I carried a leather portfolio that had belonged to Graham and that I had found still in its original box, in the third drawer of his desk in Philadelphia. I signed in at the security desk with my name and my new title, Marcus Delaney, Chairman, Hartwell Capital Group. The receptionist printed my badge. She smiled. I rode the elevator to 34. The room had 8 people in it when I walked in. 2 of them I didn't know. 5 of them I recognized from the Vantage org chart I had spent 40 minutes studying the previous evening. 1 of them at the far end of the table. In the third seat from the right, in a charcoal jacket, with a pale yellow pocket square, was Richard Calloway. He was looking at his phone when I walked in. He looked up when the door opened. He looked at me. He looked at the badge on my lapel. He looked back at my face. The smile was gone. I took my seat at the head of the table. I set Graham's portfolio down. I opened it to the first page, which had nothing written on it yet, and uncapped the pen I'd carried in from my jacket pocket. "Good morning," I said. "Let's get started." What followed was not a confrontation. I want to be clear about that too. There were no raised voices. Nobody was escorted from the building. I did not make a speech. What happened across the next 3 hours was a board meeting, structured, documented, occasionally contentious in the way that meetings about money and direction tend to be, but fundamentally professional. I raised 4 agenda items that had not been on the prepared agenda. I asked specific questions about 3 recent capital allocation decisions that the existing board had approved without, as far as I could determine, adequate independent analysis. I proposed and received preliminary agreement on an external audit of 2 subsidiary divisions that had been reporting inconsistent numbers for 6 quarters. At no point did I mention Richard by name. I didn't need to. His portfolio included both of the subsidiaries I had flagged. By the time the meeting ended, Richard Calloway had gone from a man who smiled at other people's misfortune to a man who was very quiet and very still, and clearly trying to remember everything he had ever said or signed off on in 11 years at this company. I was not cruel to him. I want to say that plainly. I was not unkind to him. I treated him exactly the way he had treated me for 11 years, not viciously, not dismissively, just with a kind of professional neutrality that made very clear the distance between what he had assumed about me and what was actually true. That neutrality is something I had practice with. I had practiced it in 11 years of meetings where my work was credited to someone else. I had practiced it in the break room, at company events, in the elevator. I had practiced it in my own home. In the years when Sandra and I had become people who lived in the same apartment and knew less and less about each other's actual lives. In the weeks that followed, the audit proceeded. Its findings were not criminal. I want to be accurate about that, but they were significant enough to prompt a restructuring of the 2 divisions, which included changes in personnel at the senior level. Richard Calloway submitted his resignation on a Thursday morning, before any formal action was taken. His letter was 3 sentences. I read it once and filed it. Sandra heard about it through a mutual friend. Or so I assumed, because she called my cell phone on a Saturday evening while I was in Philadelphia, sitting in Graham's study surrounded by his books, trying to figure out what I thought about anything. He let it ring. She called again on Sunday. I let that one ring too. On Monday, she sent a text message. I heard about what happened. I want you to know I didn't know any of this. I hope you're okay. I read it twice. Then I set the phone down on Graham's desk, next to the leather portfolio and a half-drunk mug of coffee. And I looked out the window at the yard behind the house, where a tree I didn't know the name of was doing whatever trees do in October, which is let go of things slowly and without drama. I didn't respond that day, or the next. I responded eventually. I wrote, "I know you didn't know. I'm okay. Take care of yourself. Sandra." I meant both sentences. My sister Caroline called me 2 days after the board meeting. She had seen something online, a business brief. The one of those aggregator sites that picks up board appointments and restructurings and turns them into 3-sentence items. And she had done the math and arrived at a question she asked me directly, in the way that only Caroline could. Marcus, are you actually the chairman of the company that fired you? Technically. I said, yes. There was a silence that I counted. 4 seconds. Graham knew. She said finally. It wasn't a question. I think he suspected I might need it someday. I said, he never said that. But he knew what Vantage was. He knew I worked there. He knew what kind of person Richard was. Because I told him. Once? About 4 years ago. Over the phone. Late at night when I was tired enough to say true things. And he left you the shares anyway. He left me the shares because of all that. I said, another silence. Shorter this time. You didn't tell Sandra before she filed. No. You could have. Yes. Why didn't you? I thought about this. I had thought about it many times over the course of those 32 days. And then again in the weeks after. In quiet moments when the logistics of everything gave way to the actual question underneath it. Because I wanted to know. I said, what she actually thought. What she actually decided. When she believed there was nothing. Caroline was quiet for a moment. That's either very wise or very sad. Probably both. I said. She laughed. It was a small laugh. The kind that means you've been holding tension for a while and finally found somewhere to put it down. I laughed too. We talked for another hour. About nothing in particular, about her kids. About the house she was thinking of buying. About a restaurant she'd been to that she said I had to try. Normal things. The kind of conversation that doesn't know it's happening after the most consequential months of someone's life and doesn't need to. I still live in the same city. I moved out of the apartment Sandra and I shared and into a smaller place closer to downtown. A 2-bedroom on a high floor, with windows that face west and catch the last of the light in the evening. It sweet me. I never needed much space. I needed, for most of my adult life, to be the kind of person who could be trusted to do good work quietly and not ask for too much, and then, when the moment came, to simply be present in the room where the decision was made. I think about Graham sometimes. I think about what it means to be seen by someone who doesn't announce that they're seeing you. He never told me he was proud of me. He never said anything that direct, but he handed me something. At the end of his life, that could only have been intended as a message. I know what you're capable of. Here is the room. Walk in. I walked in. I have one photograph from that morning, taken by someone I don't know who posted it on LinkedIn as part of a brief caption about the Vantage Group quarterly meeting. I'm walking through the lobby of the building, the badge visible on my lapel, the portfolio under my arm. I'm not smiling in the photo. I'm not frowning either. I look like a man who knows where he's going. Richard, in the month since, has started a consulting practice. I've heard his name mentioned twice in contexts that had nothing to do with me. Which means he's rebuilding something. I don't wish him badly. I don't wish him anything in particular. He taught me something. Across 11 years of being overlooked. That turned out to be useful, that the people who smile at someone else's misfortune almost never see what's coming for them. Not because the universe is just, but because that kind of smile requires you to look at someone else's face. And while you're doing that, you stop looking at the room. The room is where everything happens. I learned that from my Uncle Graham, who never said it out loud, but built an entire life on the principle. I try to run Hartwell the way he would have wanted, carefully, patiently, with attention to things that don't announce themselves. I'm not him. I'm not going to pretend I have his instincts or his depth of experience. But I have time. And I have the shares. And I have the memory of a cream-colored envelope on a desk, a folder full of divorce papers, and a man in a doorway smiling at what he thought was the end of something. It wasn't the end. It was just the last Tuesday before everything changed.